Welcome to Our City. I'm your host, Martina Scalenzi. Today, we are doing our season finale. It's June 16, and Our City has reached the end of its run for this year. We'll be back next year, but today we have a very good show planned for you. We're doing a full half-hour feature chat with Hamilton's new head of planning and economic development, Jason Thorne. Jason, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
So you are actually from Hamilton, and you grew up in Ancaster. You've been all over the world, and now you're here taking over our Planning and Economic Development Department. That's pretty exciting. So I want to first ask if you can just explain to our audience what exactly planning is, and then I want to ask a little bit about you yourself. So tell us what this is, this career field planning.
That's a big question, and the department that I'm with is actually about much more than just planning. Mm-hmm. But planning is basically, it's looking at how you're going to manage growth in a city. Where do you want development to happen? Where don't you want development to happen? What form do you want it to take? Mm-hmm. It's also about thinking very far into the future about the kind of infrastructure and servicing you're going to need to support development. So whether that's hard infrastructure like water and sewers, but also thinking about where the park's going to be, where the recreation center is going to be, and how is all of that going to work together to create a really livable place. And the tools then in your toolbox include permitting and zoning and all sorts of other things, right? That's right. So there are regulatory tools. So there's zoning, there's permitting, there's various approvals that are needed to do certain forms of development. But I guess I like to think it's actually about a lot more than that. It's not just sort of those regulatory tools. It's also about just sort of a conversation and dialogue in the community about how you want a city to grow. I'm not one to look at planning as a process and rule setting, and we're just going to dictate this is how the city wants to grow, and this is where everything's going to happen. To me, it's about creating a bit of a framework for that growth, and then creating a bit of a stage then for the citizens in the community and for the developers in the community then kind of add their own thoughts and imagination to how the city evolves. I want to get to your philosophy for sure, but we're going to do that after we find a little bit more of who you are. And your department now is, as you mentioned, it's a lot more than just planning. In fact, Hamilton's recently rolled a number of departments into your department, and that includes tourism and culture, and of course real estate and economic development. So you have a pretty significant portfolio under you. It's a pretty significant portfolio for sure, and actually is one of the things that really attracted me about the job, because it is, a lot of cities look at the planning function as just planning, but I think in the department that I've now got the privilege to be part of, it's planning and economic development. It's what I've said is it takes all the different pieces of city building and puts them all in one place. So it's not just planning. It is economic development and attracting and retaining businesses, and looking at different forms of incentives and programs to support business development, support business improvement areas. And it's I think one of the great innovative things that my predecessor actually had done was to bring in the arts, the culture, and the tourism, which a lot of people think of as being quite separate, but to me those are so fundamental to creating a great city that their proper place is in the department that's responsible for growth and development and planning. So it's a huge job with a huge responsibility, but fortunately you've been given a lot of tools and stuff that you can work with. So that's fantastic. That's right, and a really fantastic team. I'm still very new on the job and still getting to know all of the folks in the department, but there are some very dedicated people in there who've been working in the department for quite some time, who know the issues really well, very dedicated to creating Hamilton as a fantastic place, and so it's really been great working with those people. Good. You are originally from Hamilton, in fact. You grew up in Ancaster. Tell us about that. Yeah, I'm a mountain kid. So actually, I initially grew up at Rymel Road and Upper James, which was kind of, at the time, out in the boonies. There wasn't a whole lot out there. It's certainly a lot different now. Yeah. And when I started high school in grade 9, moved into Ancaster and went to Sir Allan McNabb High School. And I guess it was sort of around that high school time that I started to get very interested in civic issues, and I started to get, I guess, involved in community organizations. I did a lot of volunteer work for groups that are still around today, thankfully. Bay Area Restoration Council I worked with quite a bit, and no kidding. The Hamilton Naturalist Club, and I did a lot of work for the Bruce Trail Association. So, really started to enjoy getting involved in my community, and I actually remember sort of one of my first experiences in, I guess you call it political action, when I was in high school, and I can't remember what the issue was now, but I had written a letter to my local counselor, and had sent it off, not really thinking much of it, and was shocked when about 2 days later I got a phone call from the counselor Ann Sloat. I'm sure some of your viewers will remember her.
Probably.
A very tough
Yeah.
politician.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe it. What was I, maybe 16, 17 years old, and I had sent off a letter that I'm sure was very, very self-righteous and opinionated and all the rest of it. But the councillor called me back, took the time to talk to me, and of course I got very nervous and was instantly backing off all of my positions and agreeing with just whatever she had to say within the first 30 seconds of the phone call. But that to me, that sort of a politician would take the time to sort of to just have that conversation with a kid. Really sort of got me interested in civic issues and being involved in your community and knowing that, you know, even a 16-year-old kid can sort of be involved and make a bit of a difference.
I was going to ask, that's what kind of made this stuff tangible to you then.
Yeah. Like actually getting
difference.
directly involved and seeing how, you know, your actions, however small or big they may be, could actually make a bit of a difference.
So how did you go from that phone call to going to deciding that you would become a planner, to actually go into this field professionally, not on the political side, but actually on the staff side?
It was a bit of a journey. I didn't sort of immediately set out to be a planner. I didn't go to planning school, actually.
Okay.
I was involved in a lot of environmental issues and community issues, and that's really kind of how I came into planning. I worked with a number of different community organizations, and really just found that the issues that sort of got me excited and got me interested were all somehow linked back to planning. And I kind of discovered planning that way by the work I was doing. And so I just kind of came to it through work experience and through the issues that I was interested in, and then ultimately became a planner.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So what was your training then as you got into that field? Because I know then you eventually ended up in Toronto and all over the world. How did you start building your career in there?
I guess my first sort of professional foray into planning was when I joined the province. That was in 2003, I guess it was.
Okay.
And that was sort of my first professional planning job. I worked on the Places to Grow initiative, which was an initiative of the then newly elected Liberal government to create a growth plan for the entire Greater Golden Horseshoe region, which of course include Hamilton, and also getting involved in planning for the Greenbelt and looking at sort of that broad regional scale of how the region wants to develop and where the regional transportation infrastructure should go. And that was kind of my first really diving into sort of technical planning work, and I loved it, and I did that for several years. Got to work with a lot of municipalities through that work, including Hamilton, from there I've been pretty exclusively focused on doing planning work.
Now I'm noticing a theme, because you were involved with the naturalists and you were the Bruce Trail, and then you worked with the Greenbelt and stuff. I'm noticing an environmental theme. Is that a real passion of yours?
It is, and like I said, it's kind of how I initially came to planning and came to sort of what initially got me interested in how cities grow and evolve. Certainly my interests have expanded a lot since then. I've started to realize just how many facets of how we live and work and play are all touched by planning. But I certainly came to it through an interest in environmental issues and still a passion of mine today. Yeah.
And then you ended up working in Toronto. Tell us about your professional career then as you went into the private sector.
So I worked, as I said, I worked for the province on the Places to Grow initiative. I then went and worked for Metrolinx. I was the director of planning at Metrolinx for a while, and got to lead another very exciting provincial initiative called the Big Move, the Regional Transportation Plan, which again looked at sort of at a regional scale, developing a regional transportation network for the entire Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And then from there I went into private practice with a firm called Planning Alliance, which was actually founded and started in the late 1970s by another Hamiltonian named John Van Nostrand. And he brought me in as a partner in that firm.
Okay.
And from there I got to work a fair bit in Ontario, but actually started to work a lot more across Canada, overseas, and all sorts of different planning contexts that I got to work with.
Now you spent a time in Africa as well. What were you doing in Africa? What were you planning?
I did, and certainly if you'd asked me when I was 17 years old living in Hamilton if I'd ever be working in Africa, I probably would have said no.
Planning and working in
planning
Africa.
And working in Africa, so I spent a good chunk of the last 2 years or so working in West Africa, also a bit in Central America and South America, doing planning work, doing community development work, specifically looking at often at villages, more remote villages and communities, generally impoverished areas who were starting to experience some growth pressures due typically to mining activity, which would create sort of an influx of population, all sorts of new issues coming to communities that really hadn't experienced those sorts of pressures before. and helping those communities to plan so they could kind of reap some of the benefits of some of the economic activity that was starting to happen in their areas and avoid some of the negative consequences that often come alongside large-scale economic activity in areas that were up until then very, very rural and remote. So yes, it was different. I've actually been asked a couple of times, well, what could that possibly have to do with now being the general manager of planning and economic development in Hamilton? And it's the issues are different. The context was very different. But to me, the approach was the same. I mean, the approach was about just listening to the people in the community and how they wanted their place to grow and change. So, spend a lot of time sitting under baobab trees with village elders, with imams and religious leaders, just having conversations.
It's a lot of research.
It's a lot of research, and it's a lot of listening and just talking to people. And to me, that's the same whether you're in West Africa or South America or Hamilton. It's the same. Issues are different, but the approach is the same.
How did you find that though? Because were there language barriers, and there must have been a lot of obstacles to working in an environment like that.
There were, certainly there was language barriers. There was often cultural barriers. There's quite often trust issues that had to be worked through.
Sure.
But generally people like to talk about the places where they live. And they like to think about the future. They like to think about where their place is going in the future. They like to talk about what kind of places this is going to be for their kids and their grandkids.
Yeah.
Like I said, that kind of thing it's the same, regardless of where you're doing planning work.
Interesting. So at the end of a process like that, then of sitting under these trees and speaking with people and gathering information, what does a planner do with that information? Is it a series of reports or with actual plans, or what's the product then that's produced?
It would vary. So in some cases, sort of bring it back maybe to sort of the Hamilton context or the Ontario context. Some of what we would produce would be regulatory documents, a new zoning bylaw, which are fairly prescriptive rules about the forms the development can take. Sometimes they are more vision setting, just sort of imagining a longer term future and what you're kind of working towards. Sometimes they're more guidelines. Would typically I've done a lot of work around urban design.
Okay.
A lot of the rules would deal with how tall can a building be, how big can it be, and what type of use can you allow in a certain place. When you start to get into some of the, hesitate to say softer issues because they're important issues, but issues around what is the look and feel of a building, how does it fit with the neighboring context, especially in a place like Hamilton where you have so many very important heritage areas and heritage buildings. How is new development respecting that existing development? You end up doing sort of a lot of sort of more guideline type work. So it really does run the gamut. And of course, some of the really exciting ones are the projects that can actually go straight from idea to change on the ground, in as quick a turnaround time as possible.
The low-hanging fruit,
yes.
The tangible change.
Exactly. Yeah.